changes in the way administration of wells out there. A lot of change in some of the recharge programs, and it's kind of interesting how a good thing compounds sometimes a problem, in that when there's a free river, our irrigators have learned that by putting that water into this recharge facilities really helps their ability to pump later on. But then if they don't pump later on, well, it adds up. Last year was a wet year in the Gilcrest area, and Central's allocation there was around 5%, and they only pumped about a third of that. Because they had water in the river. And when they had water in the river, it's the most economical way to irrigate. And it's also, you put more water through your recharge facilities. And so we have a real significant high groundwater. We've had reports of it coming up about a foot in the last 30 days. And so as a result of that, we had a immediate kind of emergency type of dewatering effort. The Conservation Board was able to provide funds that help match up DOLA funds in order to do this. We're still in the getting started stage. It's always, you find out who your friends are when you start doing certain things with water. And we've had several, a local drainage district, as well as a canal company that we're dealing with right now to make sure we don't have any undue impact on their operations. We have got a well permitted that will pump. The thinking behind this was some modeling done by one of the Willem Schroeder, who's a modeler as a member of the technical committee, that if we could pump this well for 30 days, we could lower the water in the immediate area maybe a foot, and in 6 months 2 foot. And so if we can ground truth that modeling, why then that'll help inform us on what we can do with some other wells in the area. The other intermediate is to pump 4 to 5 more wells in the immediate Gilcrest area. And it's kind of interesting as we've visited with people in the area. Some people say, well, it's worth a try. Other people say it won't work. And so that's all the more reason to go ahead and do this. And so as a result of this high groundwater, in addition to the funding I just mentioned from DOLA and the Conservation Board, why House Bill 1178 was passed, that provided, I believe, $165,000 this year, or this coming fiscal year, and then $250,000 the following year. And then in addition to that, the project bill, at your last meeting, I think you had the discussion with Senator Sonnenberg, and there's an additional $125,000 available out of that for South Platte purposes. So about $290,000 available for this coming fiscal year. And so there's a lot of things be done on how that water will be put out in the form of most likely grants. If we can prove some of these pumping dewatering theories, I think it'll give attention to maybe a potential pipeline that could help take care of Gilcrest immediate area, and explore the possibility of different management schemes on handling groundwater. And then the third long-term or the other project that was assigned to this technical committee was to look at infrastructure and storage options that would help assist and augment groundwater utilization in the South Platte. We started those discussions at the last meeting. And so you'll hear a little more from Andy Moore, I think tomorrow, as he talks about some of the modeling and some of the groundwater issues in the South Platte they've been looking at. I think he'll include some information. They're still working on the Brown and Caldwell analysis of the monitoring systems have been in place for going on 3 years now in the Sterling area as well as the Gilcrest area. So just that's kind of a recap of where the technical committee is at this point. As I mentioned earlier, I think we're meeting the 27th will be our 13th meeting. Well attended, very serious engineer type of and water manager type of people there. So any questions about that project?
Director Stolp, I just wanted to thank you for chairing this task force. I think it's a pretty interesting group that you put together, and I really appreciate your efforts here. I think everyone's learned a lot from the studies that you've done so far and going around and talking to the community. So thank you for doing that. I think this will provide some interesting data and hopefully some solutions.
Thank you. We have a lot of people that are watching and participating from town of Gilchrist, the county government of Weld County, their road and bridge department, and a lot of farmers, a lot of people, I think, and numerous state agencies. I think there's about 12, 15 different entities that are curious about what we're up to and are giving us advice. So hopefully we won't stagnate with regulation. So then to turn to the IBCC, as you know, the IBCC has been working a lot on the water plan efforts and contributing to it. There's been different committees, subcommittees that were set up some time ago: finance, ag viability, conservation, legislative concepts, and then the conceptual framework group. At our meeting on the 30th, we had a real good discussion. I'm going to send this kind of a summary because there's a lot of details, I think, in what we talked about, and then you can have this to look through. I would mention that I think at least four of the board members were in attendance on the 30th in West Denver, Lakewood, and we had a very engaged discussion, and I think these are kind of the consensus as we got to. The main topics we had were the municipal conservation and efficiency, and then the ag viability, as well as legislative concepts discussion, and a short report on the conceptual framework. Is that subcommittee continues to work on that. But backing up to the conservation efficiency discussion is that I think the consensus was to have a stretch goal put out there, and doesn't mean we know exactly how we're going to get to it, but it's going to cause us to stretch. Not only as the governor, emphasized conservation, but I think our municipals have a great record on what they have done in the last 10, 12 years on stretching or getting conservation practices with some of the recent articles, like Denver Waters using the same amount of water now for 350,000 more people that they were, I believe, 30 years ago. There's other communities that have similar type of impressive statistics. And so the conservation efficiency idea is working. A goal of 400,000 acre feet was set on a statewide basis as a stretch. I'm reminded of some discussion we had in one of the subcommittees on conservation, that one of the municipal participants mentioned that he said, we don't exactly know what technology we're going to have to use, but we're confident there will be new technology available for us as we approach 2050. And so there's certainly a leap of faith on the part of people in long range water planning. And so I think that's kind of interesting that and they were looking back in the sense that how much progress they had made. Had you gone back 30 years and said, well, can you water 350,000 more people in 30 years with the same amount of water? Well, a lot of people would probably said it unlikely, but they did, and the quality of life has remained the same. So as far as the implementation that's there in front of you is having accountability. There was discussion around the 1051 legislation on municipals reporting, best practices, which we know will vary from provider to provider. Obviously, we're in Colorado, so we want to maintain local control, but we feel that that's important to step up the discussion with our local control people and see how we can help them have that local control that encourages more water conservation. And then the monitoring, as well as adaptive management to get, depending on which scenario happens. And I think everybody's in agreement that we can we're doing well, but we can do more with conservation. And then as we went to the ag viability discussion, this task group had met several times with not only IBCC members, but also some of the Colorado Agriculture Water Alliance folks. And so they participate in this. I think they also had submitted a letter that you, I believe, seen, and it's part of the record for the water plan on some suggestions. And so, looking at long-term viability, and I think we all are aware, and especially this board, had it not been for the concern about the future of agriculture, we wouldn't even be talking about a water plan. But we know that where a lot of the water originates there, it's so important to protect that industry and the relationship it has with rural development, and then it kind of provides our 3 meals a day too. So again, there's suggested a program to facilitate more agriculture opportunities, and this is beyond just water. It was on, I think, getting young farmers involved and addressing some of the barriers to why do we see the older generation selling water and leaving agriculture. Are there some opportunities through conservation easements and a number of suggestions like that we could look at? There's some issues on having uniform applications in the water courts. So there's some consistency for agriculture as they go to change or have temporary changes. And then the incentives to reduce the fragmentation of agricultural lands. And this goes back to kind of land use, local control. And so it's one of those things you kind of go into very gingerly, and yet if locals don't start working with us, we're going to continue to fragment and have these sprawling issues. I think that's, and then there's 10 different items with the ag viability. One of the more interesting one is the framework for evaluations of agricultural transfers. And the staff did a great job of figuring out a different terminology than an ag impact statement. Because I think people are always concerned when you say impact statement, they're thinking of environmental impact statements and the responsibilities that go along with that. And so I think they've done a good job here of, and this is still up for discussion. There's no firm consensus other than to continue the dialogue and see how would it be used, who would it be helpful for, and we had a good discussion on that. And then pilots, the discussion of having some flexibility in the pilots and the House, at the time we were discussing this, I don't think Senate Bill 198 had been signed yet, but it has been. And that gives more flexibility to those pilots that this board initiated the legislation for 1248 a couple years ago, but it only could be ag to municipal. And now they'll have the ability to go ag to ag to industrial, ag to non-consumptive or environmental type of things. So I think that was kind of a step in the right direction and consistent with the discussion about the water plan. Obviously, to look at the aging infrastructure, ag has a lot of infrastructure that's 100+ years old. And what are the opportunities there to not only help ag, but maybe other even non-consumptive issues. Regulations are always a concern. And some of the wording in there is to get a better understanding of the regulations. I have to give you kind of a cute sidebar. I met with a reservoir company in the last couple of weeks, and they accused the state of taking their water for non-use. And I said, no, wait a minute. The state doesn't even have a place to put the water if they were so minded. And I think it's your downstream neighbors and users that are concerned on if you're hoarding water. And there was a silence in the room, and I said, as long as you're staying within your decree, nobody's upset. But I said, when somebody gets upset, that's when they send the water commissioner to visit you and ask about your accounting on your reservoir and things like that. And so, maybe you're right, type of thing. But anyway, it's kind of interesting. I think it's important to get understanding why we have this regulation and not pin all of it on Dick Wolf, that he's just out there being, possessive of all the water in Colorado. So, and then no surprise, the last one, there's additional recommendations of funding, more adequate funding for agriculture infrastructure and the role of agriculture in some of these identified projects and processes. And then the third part of our meeting was spent on the legislative concepts. And again, these are draft, and it's kind of a dicey way to go sometimes. If you get too specific, then you have some people without being as well informed may take this and make a bill out of it. But that's why we have a General Assembly, and so I think these are some of the concepts that we had pretty good consensus on. Is like on new development in Colorado, what should be the expectation of water efficiency and water conservation there? And again, this kind of goes back to local land use and local regulation. But the consensus was to continue to deal with DOLA or work with DOLA and other state agencies. Senate Bill 8 provide an opportunity for water providers to have educational classes on what we're thinking about. Leakage, water leakage, or water loss reporting, to get an understanding of that. I remember at the beginning of the last legislative session, there were a couple legislators that were really concerned about these high numbers, and if you could just bring them down, that in itself would constitute an additional water supply. But as you look into that, yes, there are some leaking pipes, but there's also when you flush fire hydrants and you fight fires and some things like that, that's kind of an unmetered type of use of water. And so there's a lot of, we need to just have a better understanding of how water is being used. And just because it doesn't go through a meter, beneficial or a good use for socially. So I think there's going to be some, and there are some communities that have extremely high water losses and they don't know where they're at. And therein lies an opportunity, I think, as this board funds future projects and as we look at where to invest money. And then the last, there was review of water sense or outside water efficiency fixtures. And it's kind of similar to what was passed a couple of years ago on indoor fixtures. And the question is the time right for that? And so that's kind of a summary of. Then we did not on this sheet, but we did have a report back from the folks that are working on the conceptual framework, and I think we'll have a more firm report available. I think progress is being made, and that there'll be probably be the topic of the primary topic of the next IBCC meeting as we get that worked out. And then I think we'll take up some of this in more detail, perhaps in agenda item 7 after the reports. So my apologies for being such long-winded and such a long report.
Thank you, John. Are there questions for Director Stahl? If not, we will move on to Director Brown from the Department of Agriculture. Welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Chairperson. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. It's a pleasure to sit in a soggy environment. I live about 60 miles southeast of here in Yuma, Colorado, over the Ogallala. And of course, it's a pleasure to look at my phone and WagNet and see all those circles, and there isn't a darn one of them running this morning. Every one of them's red, and it's because we want them to be that way. So it's a delight to be here. I couldn't help but think people's understanding and concepts of where water comes and the role it plays was interesting. When I checked in at my motel yesterday, I commented to the young man, the parking lot's clear full of cars, and I commented to the young man, the desk clerk, that isn't this rain nice? And he said to me, you're the first one that said that. And so I'm nervous this morning. I think, good grief, And so, but anyway, we're trying hard. I'm going to talk about the Ag Department. The water deal is wonderful, and you will cover a great deal of subjects and have much more to provide on that than I will. I'd like to comment about 2 or 3 things that we've done in the Ag Department. We've appointed Chris Wiseman as a deputy commissioner, and he typically runs the Colorado State Fair. When I got on board, I took several weeks to make that decision, recognized that I was a farmer and a rancher and brought that input, and that he, since he was familiar with the Colorado Department of Ag and had been there a long time, could provide the legislative expertise and the day-to-day things that I was unaware of. Late last week, I spent 2 days in New Mexico with the Department of Ag down there. We had a 5-state region forum basically to discuss federal lands, rules, and regulations. 36% of Colorado is federal, so it has a definite impact. I come from deeded country, so I obviously don't recognize or completely understand the measure that carries within the state. Wyoming was there, New Mexico was there, Utah, Nevada, and of course ourselves. At the end of the day, we're going to make an effort to have some type of 5-state region where we're going to communicate a lot more and see if we can't have a positive effect. I mean, it was a very, very interesting story about the 10J rule, which occurs in New Mexico. They have decided to reintroduce the Mexican gray wolf south of I-40. I-40 cuts basically across New Mexico. Oh, it's above Central, but anyway, in the central area. South of I-40 is the 10J area, which means if you accidentally take or hit or kill one of these wolves, they won't send you to federal prison for 100 years or shoot you at noon. They don't shoot you at dawn. And so that was good, the New Mexico people commented. They thought that was great. However, they have a little bit of a problem. It appears as though the Mexican gray wolf is not recognizing I-40 as a 10J line. And he wants to cross north. And once he gets north, he's no longer 10J classification. He's an endangered species. And so you will be shot at dawn. And so this was their comments. It was kind of interesting to listen to. We've talked about the dialogue. So it's obvious that we have a lot of areas and things that we need to be concerned about. And of course, the ferret was introduced in Wyoming under the 10J, and they've got rules. But anyway, we're headed down that road with some of our species here, as we're well aware of. I had an opportunity, it's been a week, 10 days ago now. Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack was in town. A little bit of an interesting story there. You know, weekends is when we try to catch up at home a little bit on that farm and ranch. I think we had 5 tractors running on a Sunday afternoon, and it's 2 in the afternoon, and my phone rings, my personal phone, and I pick my personal phone up, and good grief, it's John Hickenlooper. So I say, well, Governor, how are you doing? I'm doing great. He said, I suppose you're home, aren't you, Don? Well, I am. It's 2 o'clock. I said, I am. He said, I think I can hear a tractor running. I said, I think you're right. He said, I know it's 2.5 hours to Denver, but he said, I'm having a barbecue at 6:30. Would you like to come? And he said, bring Peggy too. And she's running a tractor also, right? So I said, well, we'll be there. He's very devoted to agriculture, the governor is. And of course, he was having Secretary Vilsack over at his house. So he wanted me to have an opportunity to have a real one-on-one dialogue with him. And so it was appreciated. The lamb chops that the governor cooked were excellent. And I had an opportunity to really sit down with Secretary Vilsack. We also, the next morning, then signed the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. It was launched in Denver, Colorado, which was kind of nice. The formal signing of the bill was done there, or the act, the component of it that made it happen. And Colorado's received 2 pieces from that. We have this small hydro project, which is used to generate electricity or mechanical power to drive pivot sprinklers, primarily on the western slope where we have enough elevation and drop to generate some form of power. And also there's the selenium project on the lower Gunnison Basin, which we were part of. So we received some funding there. The 2013 flood grants, which were administered through the Department of Ag, when I got on board, I recognized that we had 1 staff member for a 10 staff person job. We were also struggling a little bit with the components that it appeared as though we would do our work, then turn it over to the powers that be, and then they'd say, no, your work wasn't good enough, but when are you going to issue the checks? And there was a lot of questions and things that were there. Finally, I discovered that this was the first time HUD had ever done a farm-based program. And so the rules had moved and changed. And so at the end of the day, we went to DOLA, and DOLA sent a bunch of their people over, and we all went to work on it together. We're going to make this happen. It's happening. It's at a slow pace, but we're going to get there. I know I appreciate the farmers being patient. And right now, of course, they're busy planting, and so they don't really want to talk to us. And I understand that completely, having been there before myself. But we're getting there on the 13 stuff. They want to go to the farmers Schedule F. They want to go to, I believe it's line 9, as I recall, which is gross income. And anything over $750,000 gross income makes it so you don't qualify for the HUD program. But they're going to gross income. They're not subtracting the expenses. So at the end of the day, you look at a lot of these returns, the guy might have lost $49,000, but he had $2.1 million. You can't eat gross income. You only eat down at the bottom on line 34. And so worked on that component, and I think we may get them to override that. Pesticide bill SB 119, the sunset hit on our Pesticide Applicator Act. You think it doesn't affect all of us, but really does, all the ditch companies and everybody. We had some, on the House side of it, they had quite a few amendments that they put on Senate Sonnenberg's version of it. We struggled with that mightily. If it had gone away and reverted back to the EPA, the Colorado Uniformity Act would have disappeared. Consequently, every little municipality could have had their own set of rules and regs. Can you imagine a ditch running through a half a dozen different municipalities and somebody trying to take care of that? At the end of the day, the governor and I worked quite hard on it, and then Senator Sonnenberg took care of it, and we had our bill, and we're not going back to the EPA with our Pesticides Act. They're not equipped to handle it. They have no interest in it anyway. Getting it back, and they made that pretty clear in the letter, but they do have to handle if it winds up in their lap. So we escaped that. I don't have a lot more to say about the Department of Ag. This afternoon, later, National Western Stock Show, House Bill 1344 is going to be signed at the facilities there. The governor has requested my presence and said if I'm going to be there, I am to give a few remarks. That'll be interesting. But anyway, I will be leaving later this afternoon, and having been gone from the office, I won't be back tomorrow. But I really appreciate. I'll be here as long as I can today, and then I'll go keep the boss happy. Maybe he'll fix us a lamb chop, right? I want everybody here in the room to know that we're planting irrigated corn. We're planting corn. We're planting it at a loss. It's a negative right now, the day we put it in the ground. But as we always say at our place, you got to be in to win. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Director Brown. Other questions? Seeing none, we will move on to Director Eklund.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, Director King, in spirit of our discussion on the legislative disclaimer I'm going to give moving forward, these headlines you're about to see are my own and have not been approved by this board or by the administration for that matter. So I want to start just by thanking Joe Frank and Jim Yon and the local ditch and reservoir companies for the presentations and the barbecue last night. We had to call a few audibles, or they did, along with Mara, and they did scramble and came up with a space to hold us all. And it was a great event for those of you who could attend. This first one, thank you, Mara. This is South Platte River demands better working conditions and overtime pay. If you drove over the bridge on the way over here, you can see it working pretty hard. And there are flood watches and warnings on the river in effect. And if any of those develop through the course of our meeting today and tomorrow, then I'll be sure to jostle the elbow of our chairwoman. There are no dams compromised as of this morning, as far as I know. Mike Sullivan's here and giving me the thumbs up on that, so that's good. But staff is actively monitoring the situation. We're set up for a strong El Nino pattern and it seems that it could bring bigger rain events of this kind moving into the summer here. So we're obviously keeping a close eye on burn scars in particular. Our diligent Kevin Hauk and Chris Sturm, I don't think they're here. They're probably out running around. There's Kevin. They can get into detail on this, but they're working hard to administer an NRCS grant program. He might have talked about that over the lamb chops with you, Director Brown. But in any event, he and Chris are both working hard to set up the administration that we would need to run as a CWCB for that program. It's a grant program in excess of $500 million that's intended to provide watershed protection measures related to the September 2013 flooding. And so, speaking of flooding, that produced this headline: bags filled with sand, still most advanced anti-flood technology available. Unfortunately, that's maybe a little too true. We're trying to change that in this basin, though, as this board is acutely aware. And as Dr. Stolt mentioned in his report, we have an ongoing basement flooding issues in Gilchrist, LaSalle, and Sterling, and we're working hard to address these issues both through existing programming and the projects bill, thanks to the help of regional legislators that he went into. And I'm not going to go into that detail. But speaking of those legislators, I thought this next headline was a little odd, but it cleared some things up for me. Senator says second half of session really just one big April Fool's Day joke. I think there are a lot of water bills. As Director King noted, there were, let me go through the numbers here. There were 682 bills that were run during the session. DNR received and reviewed approximately 109 bills of the 682, so doing more than its fair share of the lift, more than a sixth of the bills. The CWCB reviewed 46 of the 109 bills sent to DNR during the session, approximately 43% of those, and the CWCB reviewed 38 of those bills were water bills, and CWCB or DNR or DWR reviewed those, and that's more than a threefold increase over last year's numbers. So big thank you, and I know they're here in the audience, to Executive Director King's office for all their exceptional help this session with a very heavy lift, in particular Gaspar Perricone. He may have stepped out to get coffee. Lauren Riz, Madeline West, Bill Levine, many other folks that were laboring hard all session long to get us to a good place with the legislature and make sure that these bills were on track and informed moving in that process. Thanks on our staff to Tina Heltzel, Tom Browning, and Tim Feehan, and all of our section chiefs for their help during the, questions that would come our way on fiscal notes or on technical testimony to turn these bills around. What these numbers say to me is that the Colorado Water Plan and the work of this board is resonating with the legislature, and they're eager to hear our recommendations as a board and as a water community and as a state through this process. So, the work is important. They recognize that, and I think we're going to see more and more going forward. Some more interest in what we have to say. This one, Garfield County Commissioners offer animal sacrifice to Rush George prior to meeting. That actually happened. He's so respected, and for good reason. We had a really good conversation about the 7 points, and as you'll hear from the basins on their plans and the staff on outreach, things are certainly moving forward on all aspects of the plan, but in particular, that most sexy, glamorous of issues, Trans Mountain diversion discussions. We're certainly we're headed into a place where I think people want to be informed. They want to make good decisions. They don't want to make knee-jerk responses. And that was certainly the case over there with the county commissioners in Garfield County. You'll hear more about this, obviously, in the agenda item coming up here very soon. But we've received over 3,000 comments, well over 3,000 comments in the last comment period alone on the water plan. So trains on the tracks there. Apparently, the Journal Advocate here